Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the global seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean of Undergraduate Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so excited that you've joined us today for a conversation about the US elections and what comes next. Now, with only a few days left until the US chooses its next president, while every state in our country is also still grappling with the tremendous impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on a daily basis, there is much to be discussed about the current election cycle and how the rest of the world views the latest developments in the US. So today, it is indeed an honor to have some distinguished experts here with us as a part of the Global Columbia Collaboratory to have a robust discussion about these timely issues. The Global Columbia Collaboratory is a virtual exchange platform supported by the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement in partnership with the Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects. The Collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together. It promotes cross-cultural communication, and it enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. The global seminars, such as our seminar today, frame important global topics, and reflection activities provide a focused opportunity for students to share diverse perspectives on the global challenges presented in the seminars. As learnings and perspectives are shared across the collaboratory, the ideation activities support the creative process of generating and communicating new ideas, and students are encouraged to collaborate to support the further development of ideas into projects that have the potential to address the most urgent challenges of our time. Now, we are thrilled that the fall cohort of 70 collaboratory participants, including undergraduate students from Columbia College, General Studies, and Columbia Engineering, are kicking off their collaboratory experience with this important global seminar. And they are joining us today representing 23 countries around the world. Some of our students will ask questions to our panelists, and I encourage the global audience to also submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Again, I want to welcome everyone, and I want to thank all of our partners and our esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Centers for these seminars. And at this time, I want to introduce Safwan Masri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, who will introduce us to our panelists today. Safwan?
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome all of you, to welcome our panelists, and to welcome our students who have just started in the Global Columbia Collaboratory, and to welcome also audience members from around the world. I don't think that there's anything that is most important to discuss at this point, a few days before the US elections, than what we have on the menu today. And what we will be discussing is perhaps the most widely anticipated US elections of our lifetime. What makes it distinctive is the level of global interest as well. What makes it extraordinary is the level of consequence and the potential for disruption. This holds true not just for America, but for the world. And so joining us today to discuss the current US national elections, the process, we're going to discuss the ground game, as well as predictions, Andy, are panelists who bring expertise from a variety of fields, including statistics, economics, regional, and local politics. They and our Columbia University students will offer a variety of perspectives to a topic that has dominated the front page or been the lead story in the international press for months, if not years. These have been 4 long, exhausting years, to be precise. So I'm going to start by introducing Professor Andrew Gelman. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Gelman, who is a professor of statistics and political science at Columbia University. He earned an SB in mathematics and physics from MIT and a PhD in statistics from Harvard. He has received the Outstanding Statistical Application Award from the American Statistical Association 3 times, and he is the author of many books, including Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, Why Americans Vote the Way That They Do. Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you here today. And I'm going to turn to you with a very basic question to get this started. The question is, what made you decide to use the power and lessons of statistical research to look at voting patterns in the United States? What was unique about this research for you? And perhaps you can talk a little bit. I mean, I know that you run a popular statistical blog that is famous for its prediction of presidential elections. What factors do you weigh in making your predictions? So I'm going to turn it over to you and perhaps even add another sub-question, Andrew, and that is, what have you changed in your statistical analysis, if anything, and in the factors that you have used for your predictions between 2016 and 2020? So for example, we hear a lot about how the 2016 polls failed to predict the outcome, partially because they failed to account for the education level of voters. You know, how has that been corrected? How have other things been corrected? So over to you, Andrew.
So we're doing different things. When I'm working with actual pollsters, yeah, so survey organizations need to, the samples are not representative of the population. Lots of people don't respond to surveys, so survey organizations do need to adjust for factors like education and partisanship of voters and who you voted for in the previous election, whether you voted in the previous election, factors like that. And doing these adjustments can become challenging. The simple, for example, if you do a survey and it gets too many women and not enough men compared to the general population, then you can reweight the respondents and count the men more and the women less. You can do similar things if a survey gets too many old people and not enough young people. But when it becomes more complicated, if you these simple approaches do not won't work so well. So more advanced methods are needed. I mean, in some sense, there's not a question like, should people use statistics to analyze their data? There's no other choice, right? So if you say, well, what if someone tried to forecast election? What if someone said, I don't want to forecast elections? Well, people are going to make predictions. And what if someone said, I don't want to use statistics? They are using statistics. Right? So if you say, I look at last year's election and that's my starting point, you're already using numbers. So you want to use it better rather than worse. In our forecast for The Economist magazine, we are not looking at raw data from surveys. So we're not doing survey adjustment. We're kind of trusting that the surveys are doing their best based on their commercial motivation, because most survey organizations, most survey organizations lose money on political questions. And the reason why they put political questions on their polls is that they can get in the news. Their political questions, like horse race questions, are loss leaders. So survey organizations have a motivation to get the answer right, because if they get the answer wrong, it's bad for their reputation. That doesn't mean they get it right. It's just that they have a motivation for getting it right. All the drug companies have a motivation for developing a COVID vaccine. It doesn't mean we have a vaccine yet. Motivation's not enough. But that particular issue of the adjustment, we're kind of assuming the survey organizations have adjusted for that. That said, we have error terms in our model. So we say historically, surveys have been off by more than their stated margin of error. So we allow for that possibility this year.
Great. So Andrew, just following up on that and taking into consideration, all of those factors and sort of motivators in the polling and the research analysis, what has your analysis predicted? What has it predicted in 2016? What have you learned from those predictions? And I know you get asked this question a lot, and it's on everybody's mind, of course. What should we expect to happen next Tuesday?
So first, I should say we didn't use our model in 2016. So we created this model and then applied it to 2008, 2012, and 2016 to see if the forecast made sense. So if you apply it to 2016 retroactively, then you would say that Hillary Clinton was favored. She was supposed to win, so the polls had errors. The model allowed for the polls to have errors, but it didn't say ahead of time which direction the errors were in. So the model couldn't like reach into the individual polls and find out their problems, and like it wasn't analyzing the raw data like that. So in some sense, given the information available in 2016, I think the best you can say is that either side could have won, but Hillary Clinton had the advantage. In 2020, it's well, with the economy going the way it is and the president not being popular, that created a background under which the challenger, the Democratic challenger, was favored. And then, of course, Joe Biden has been leading Donald Trump in the polls. We don't, so again, it would be hard to do anything else but have the Democratic candidate be in favor, given the information that's there. So in that case, like a lot of the discussion has to do with how much he's in favor. He's been around 54 or 55% of the two-party vote in the polls for months, and we forecasted him to be about that much ahead of time. So we would guess he would get about 54% of the vote. That's our best estimate, and then there's some uncertainty about that estimate. And right now, it seems very unlikely. It seems very unlikely based on the information we have that he would lose the popular vote. In fact, it seems unlikely he would get less than 51% of the popular vote. So it would be hard for him to lose in the Electoral College also. But there are things that are happening that are not in the model. So the fundamentals, prediction, and the surveys are all about public opinion. The surveys, to some extent, try to adjust for likely voters. They don't do such a great job of that. That's much harder. It's harder for surveys to adjust for likely voters because a lot more people vote than answer the polls. So
That's
to use
right.
a survey to adjust for likely voters is like using a crude tool to estimate a very fine, a fine adjustment. That's very challenging. So if voter turnout is indeed higher than before, that could favor the Democrats. And if millions of votes get thrown out or not counted for legal reasons, that could favor the Republicans, and that's not in our model. I mean, like many of you, I find it distressing that it's sort of a horrible legacy of the 2000 election that somehow the campaigns are talking about using the courts to get what they want. That's very upsetting. I mean, this is not in previous elections. Sometimes this would be alluded to, but this has reached a whole new level in this election, which is not at all in our model, and sort of upsetting in its own way.
Absolutely, on many levels, and the Supreme Court today in 2020 looks very different than it did in the year 2000, to put it mildly. So, I mean, there have been, and I want to turn to Cooney and Zachary in a second. So there are many different scenarios that have been painted about what we might expect next week, and one of those scenarios is that things might be decisive, right? Even considering all the factors that you have just commented on. And I see Zachary nodding his head, so maybe something, Zachary, when we get to you, can comment on. But just before we leave Professor Gelman for the time being, can you comment on that, and also on the tension between the Electoral College system and the popular vote? So when you applied, for example, your model to the 2016, I think if I understood you correctly, retroactively, it would have predicted that Hillary Clinton would have won, which she did, at least as far as the popular vote is concerned. So can you talk just very briefly about sort of that tension between the popular and the Electoral College, and where you see it playing out? You mentioned sort of the 51% perhaps of the popular vote would be won by Biden, maybe 54, 55% of the Electoral College vote. We see so much emphasis on states like Pennsylvania. So I'd love for you to just provide us with a context on this before we move on to Cooney and to Zachary.
Oh, well, I think the Electoral College, I mean, the historical reasons for it are complicated, but I think it has three bad effects on our system, or four. So the first is this crisis of legitimacy. And in the last couple of elections, it's favored the Republicans. In other years, it's favored the Democrats. But there's just the problem that the candidate who gets fewer votes is elected through some obscure rule. So that's a problem in its own right. The second is the focus on the swing states. So that's anti-democratic, that the campaign is all about appealing to people in 4 or 5 states and not much anywhere else. The third problem is the at a kind of legal level, it sets the election outcome separate from the votes. So it's kind of, there are all these questions that swirl around, like what if the electors decide that they're not going to vote for the people who voted for the candidate supported by their voters? Or what if the state legislatures decide to change the rules? So by placing things in this indirect context, you're kind of asking for trouble, because you're putting a lot of like places in the system where people can screw with things in a way that would be, I think, less so if there were, if you're counting the national popular vote. Now, that said, like in a completely abstract sense, as a citizen, I kind of like the idea of indirect voting. Like, I kind of like the idea that I don't really know these candidates. People become president, and then afterwards you hear all these things. I wouldn't necessarily mind voting for a trusted elector who would meet with a bunch of reasonable people, and then they would have a discussion and vote for somebody. Like I kind of like that idea. I don't, the electoral college is obviously not that. You don't really know who you're voting for. So it doesn't serve that particular function.
Right. It's fascinating. So I think we'll probably come back to this after we hear from a number of students. So thank you. Thank you, Professor Gelman. I want to now turn our attention to two rising stars, if I may say, in the world of voting, politics, and elections. We have with us Wen Cooney, Siandt, and Zachary Kimmel. Wen Cooney is the CEO and co-founder of Politicking, which is a mobile application with the central aim of providing election information to historically disengaged constituencies and to make election information more accessible to them, especially about micro and macro politics. Wen Cooney is a Fulbright scholar, having graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Howard University, and then received her master's in public health in health management and policy from Drexel University. And I believe, Shannon, that Wen Cooney was one of your students when you taught at Drexel. I'm also very happy to see Zachary Kimmel with us. Zachary is a senior at Columbia, graduating in May. Zachary has worked as a field campaign fellow for Let America Vote, an advocacy organization that works to elect candidates committed to voting rights. He's also interned for the ACLU in Washington, where he conducted independent research on the ways judges at the state level intercede in voting rights and redistricting reform. At Columbia, Zachary is the founder and outreach director of Columbia Votes, which is a nonpartisan voting rights organization that seeks to increase voter turnout among Columbia students. Really, the two of you are just doing magnificent work, and I'm in awe of you for all the commitment that you put into all of this. So I want to welcome both of you, and I'd love for the two of you to share initial remarks on the elections and on the youth vote in particular. And Wen Cooney, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Zachary if that's okay. Wen Cooney, based on your work, what are the challenges as well as the opportunities in helping to raise awareness and activate the youth vote, particularly minority votes? And what do political parties and politicians understand and not understand about these groups? So let's start with that.
Safwan, thank you so much for the introduction. Like you mentioned, my name is Cooney Siandt, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Politicking. I studied under the wonderful Dr. Shannon Marquez, so I would not be where I am today without her hard work. And so you guys are lucky to have her. That being, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That being said, I think the question you asked, Safwan, was so multifaceted, and I'll do my best to answer it. The biggest issue, I think, in electoral politics for millennials like myself and Zachary is that nonpartisan election information is just simply unavailable, which is why it's so inspiring to see what Zachary's doing. It's also a nonpartisan organization. I think oftentimes the mainstream media is so polarized. We're living in such a polarized society that, in fact, 72% of Americans believe traditional news outlets report news that they know to be fake, false, or purposefully misleading. So what that leads to, Safwan, is the fact that people aren't trusting the media. They feel that they can't have these conversations around a kitchen table. And so people aren't really discussing politics except with people who they know share their ideologies, which is dangerous for a wide variety of reasons. But most importantly is because as Americans, we're no longer facilitating the dialogue that's going to propel our country forward, right? And so now with politicking, which is the app myself and my co-founder created, we're taking a stand. We're like, this is no longer mom and pop's political movement. What we're trying to create is a disruptive ecosystem that's committed to providing facts, lifting voices, and empowering young voters that are committed to democracy over political dogma. So what that means is that we're less concerned about who you identify with. Whatever your political party is, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or third party member, we're less concerned about that and more concerned about you casting an educated and informed ballot. And so that's what we do. We empower our community, and particularly when I say our community, we work particularly with people that have been historically disengaged or disenfranchised for the political conversation. So unfortunately, that's people that look like you and I. And the fact of the matter is that in this year, we're seeing unprecedented rates of voter suppression. And we're seeing that all over the United States of America. We're seeing that through voter ID laws. We're seeing that through felony disenfranchisement. And so we have to be acutely aware of these types of issues. And that's the only way that we can combat them. I always tell folks is that you can't hold somebody accountable if you don't know their name. And so when Dr. Gelman was speaking, I loved what he said about, he would feel more comfortable about having an elector that actually had reasonable conversations with folks. I feel the same way, because I feel like if we actually were able to know who our electors are, and that's what we need to start doing. The Electoral College, as millennials, we can agree that it's archaic and outdated in a lot of ways. But I realized people didn't understand who actually was encompassing the Electoral College. That is your congressmen and women, and that is your senators. And so if you're not voting for them at the micro level, then by the time it gets to the presidency, it's almost too late. And so with politicking, we're fundamentally committed to helping these young voters develop their own political agenda. And so we're super excited about the work that we do.
That's fantastic. And thank you for doing it. Really, thank you for doing it. And I can see why Shannon has spoken to me so fondly of you. And we'll come back to you in a minute, when Cooney. But let us all hear from Zachary. And Zachary, given your background, especially with your focus on state judges, voter reform, and redistricting, what can you share with us about what you've learned that could help us understand some of the voter frustration issues, some of which when Cooney referred to, that we are seeing, including in this election cycle, particularly when it comes to the youth vote. So over to you, Zachary.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. First of all, it's really an honor to be amongst you on this panel. So as was mentioned, my name is Zachary. I'm a senior at Columbia, and I founded Columbia Votes as a sophomore while at school. And I think for me, something that we see often, and a bit about when Cooney was mentioning, this election and in previous elections, you're seeing really blatant, really rampant voter suppression and manipulations of the democratic process. I got my real start in this work while working in Georgia with Let America Vote during the 2018 gubernatorial election in Georgia, which really saw some pretty some pretty drastic voter suppression techniques, some pretty drastic manipulations of democracy. I came back to Columbia and wanted to get involved in civic engagement voting rights work, started Columbia Votes. And one of the first things that I noticed among the young people that I was talking to was that there was a real apathy. So on the one hand, you had people who wanted to get involved, but were having their votes suppressed. They couldn't get involved. And the other hand, you had a lot of young people who were really apathetic, who really didn't see how politics affected them, didn't see how their vote would count in a deep blue state like New York, in a deep blue city like New York City. So you have these twin ways of sort of suppression, both sort of personal suppression. I'm not interested. I'm sort of apathy, and then real structural, legal, political suppression of people who want to get involved. And I think that there's really what I've been thinking a lot about in sort of my research about state judges is that there is really, we need to think about ways in which the electorate is so warped and so distorted that people really don't feel like their vote is going to count. Even if they get to the polls, they don't really feel like their vote is actually going to count. And I think that there is a real serious through line, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about, between the level of sort of partisan extremism, partisan tribalism that we're seeing, and a really, really, really warped electorate. Now the political parties are completely at each other's throats. There is a partisan tribalism that is really intense, and most Americans all across the country really feel it. And I think that there's I think it has many causes and is sustained by many, many different forces in our political environment. But I do believe that one key underlying cause is that our democracy is really warped. Our electorate is really distorted. Politicians are less likely to take the voices of their constituents seriously if certain communities can be reliably and consistently cut out of the democratic process. If you can gerrymander a district so that you don't have to take all of those constituents' voices into account, then you can very, very easily slide towards the ideological and the political extreme. You are much less likely to engage with someone across the aisle if you know that only people on your side of the aisle are going to get to be able to vote for you. And with all of the tactics that we're seeing with extreme gerrymandering, rampant campaign financing, voter suppression that is reminiscent of the 1950s in this country, you're seeing a real slide towards partisan extremism because there aren't those mechanisms to hold public officials accountable because our democracy is so warped, because our electorate is so distorted. I really do believe that comprehensive democracy reform, whether it's a more robust Voting Rights Act, making sure that everyone who is eligible is able to participate, nonpartisan redistricting reform, more of a strong campaign financing reform, I think that those sort of common sense democracy policy initiatives will actually have a secondary benefit of lowering the temperature, the political temperature in this country, and enabling more bipartisan consensus, more reaching across the aisle, because public officials will actually have to be held accountable, or we get to be held accountable by constituents on both sides, not just the people that they select and they carve out that they want to hear from.
Thank you, Zachary. Thank you. I mean, this is so incredibly rich on so many different levels, and there are a few themes that you've hit upon. I'd love to hear Professor Gelman's response to some of them. But the issue of apathy is, I've always been astonished, as a naturalized American citizen. I'll never forget, the first time that I voted in U.S. presidential elections, and every time I've voted since then. And I can tell you also at a personal level, being halfway across the world from New York, nothing has made me more anxious, much more so than Corona and the potential sickness than getting my absentee ballot. And it was one of the happiest days when I finally got my absentee ballot and I was able to fill it and send it. And, I am from a deep blue state, such as New York. So I think, Andy, maybe the notion of, does my vote matter? Why should I bother? Is that irrational? Is it rational for a single person to vote? Is it ever rational not to vote, for example? And on the issue of redistricting that Zachary just spoke about, how do you account for the different values and impacts that you have in a state like California versus a state like Montana? And then maybe we can come back to when Cooney also and talk about the apathy factor? And do we see that trend being bucked in this election? I mean, the fact that we have more than 70 million votes through absentee and early balloting have already taken place. Are we going to be surprised? Are we going to see perhaps a record voter turnout? So I'll turn to you, Andy, with that, and then maybe you can hear from Cooney and Shannon. I invite you also to join in and direct questions to our august panelists. Andy, over to you.
Yeah, well, regarding voter turnout, the United States makes it difficult to vote. A lot of places, most states require that you register to vote. Most people who register to vote do vote in presidential elections, but not everybody registers. So that's a big hurdle right there, and that's not gonna. People aren't going to vote in this election who haven't registered either in most of the states. Some states have same-day registration, but many don't. Then, I mean, beyond issues like making it hard for people to drop off ballots, it's always been somewhat politicized, trying to obviously a lot politicized. Vote suppression in the United States has over 200-year history. So I would say it's upsetting that it's become politicized, but it's always been politicized. There have been some recent Supreme Court rulings which have made it easier for parties to do vote suppression. There's also concern about fraudulent voting, and there's very little evidence that there's been duplicate voting in the past, but that doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. And people talking about it a lot, maybe trying things. So I think that's one more thing to worry about. I don't think we can really become complacent. The particular thing that they talk about of individuals voting twice, I think is rare. But of course, it could happen more often if people are encouraged to vote twice by their political leaders, as we've seen some of. And also, there can be people voting for other people without their knowledge. So there are lots of concerns there. Regarding redistricting, I think it would be better if it could be taken out of the partisan realm. There is a view sometimes in political science that when things are partisan, it's better for them to be openly partisan. So the attitude we often have as political scientists is everything is political. You can't, but actually there are countries that do non-political drawing of districting lines. It doesn't have to be. Not everything has to be done in a partisan way. Finally, you asked about the rationality of voting. So just to step back, rationality does not imply selfishness, nor does it necessarily imply calculation. Rationality implies a kind of purposeful way of achieving one's ends. I think that voting in a swing state is rational in the following sense, that if you're in a swing state, your chance of determining the national election might be 1 in 10 million. What is if your vote is decisive, what do you get from that? You don't personally get that much from your candidate winning rather than the other candidate winning for most of us. However, you might believe that your candidate winning benefits the rest of the country. So I might feel that my candidate, just to pick a number out of the hat, I might say that my candidate winning is worth the equivalent of $5,000 for every American. Not that it makes them that much happier, because obviously a lot of people would be unhappy if my preferred candidate would win. But I feel that my preferred candidate would handle the coronavirus better, would handle the economy better, would make wiser decisions on foreign policy, climate change, government regulation, all sorts of issues that I might care about, to the extent that I think that there would be a national benefit or even a global benefit. If I were to assess this, let's say at $5,000 and then multiply it by 330 million Americans, you get a very large number. So I think of voting as a sort of lottery ticket, where you buy a lottery ticket, and if you win, and winning the lottery ticket means it's the equivalent of a huge donation to charity. So it's a way of contributing to the public good. Now, that said, voting in New York for president is not going to determine the outcome of anything. There's a small chance that it'll make a difference because it might bring your preferred candidate up to 50% in the national vote, which might have some public relations value. But I think there, by voting, I'm doing a small part to confirm the legitimacy of the political system. And when people ask about like voting being rational, one thing I always say is, what if you had a chance to vote for the Academy Awards? Like, what do you get out of it? But you might do it, right? Because you feel somehow it's important, like, to express yourself. So I think we don't participate in politics enough, probably, but this is one way that we can participate, and that's important. Finally, regarding voter turnout, I'll just remind you that in off-year elections, it's much lower. The political participation, voting in presidential elections is only the most visible form of political participation, and there are so many other forms available to us.
Thank you, and that's a very important reminder. Go ahead, Shannon, please.
Sure. I want to pick up on that very point that Andrew just mentioned, and particularly in the context of something Zachary and Cooney said earlier. But by all indications, it appears that young voters, particularly those between 18 to 29, are lining up for next week's presidential election and really coming out in big numbers, further advancing the generational shift of political power taking place in America. And it really is phenomenal to see this shift and transformation also overlaid with much of the discussion and activity around social justice in this country in this moment in time and right now. And so I really would like to hear from you about how can we really capture the momentum of this occasion that so many young voters are aware and engaged, to really get them to think about this in midterm elections and in other electoral processes where it's very important to sort of have a voice and exercise their voice so that it can be leveraged in moments like this.
So I think I can try to grapple with that question, Dr. Marquez, and a lot of the things that Dr. Gelman and Zachary said were gold. The way to capitalize on the momentum is information and mobilization. I would say it's those two tenets. So the first thing is by informing yourself, like I was saying, is the partisanship and the divisiveness of this country makes it hard for people to feel comfortable having difficult conversations about what their political agendas and ideologies actually are. We have to eradicate that sentiment in this country. We have to make people feel comfortable having those tough conversations, even if they don't agree. And the second thing is, bipartisanship is extremely important in politics. We have to reach across the aisle to get anything accomplished. And I think one of the things that you said, Dr. Gelman, in a place like New York, for example, maybe voting for president isn't going to make a huge difference because we know New York is a deeply blue state. But what people forfeit by not voting is voting for every single other person that's going to appear on the ballot. And that's what I would say to my millennials, because I'm a millennial as well, is that when you choose not to vote for president because neither of them float your boat, you forfeit the opportunity to vote for mayor, governor, superintendent, city clerk. I mean, there's attorney general. There's so many things that you're forfeiting.
Why do you say that? If you register to vote, you could not vote for president, but still vote for mayor. I don't know why you say by not voting for president, you're forfeiting your vote for mayor, because you could vote for mayor.
No, what I mean, Dr. Gelman, is that people just don't show up. They'll be like, I'm not really into voting for either X or Y, so I'm not going to go to the ballots at all. Neither candidate represents me. And this is how millennials think. A lot of them don't even know that you can just not vote for president and still fill out the rest of your ballot. So what they end up doing is saying, neither candidate speaks to me. I'm sitting this one out. And so they miss the larger portion of micro politics, the people that are actually mitigating policy in their backyards. They're not voting for it. They're not voting for the people that are actually voting in the electoral college.
I want to agree with you in principle, but state it slightly differently, which is that in poker, we talk about evaluating, you don't evaluate the play, you evaluate the strategy. And in politics, the best predictor of whether you vote is whether you voted in the previous election. So I think what you're saying, or how I would rephrase what you're saying, is that what's important is not just your vote, but to be in the habit of voting. That if voting is part of your lifestyle, then it's changing how you're thinking about politics and how you can react. And by focusing on one particular election, you're missing that point. And yeah.
I would agree with that. I would say focusing on the demographic that myself and maybe Zachary focus on is these are new voters, perhaps first-time voters. So how do we get them in the habit of building that into their behavior, building that into their psyche, that is important. And unfortunately, in Black and Brown communities, oftentimes the prowess of political capital is just simply not emphasized. And that's probably because the issues that have happened, prior, what people have seen growing up or feeling that the system isn't truly for them. But for an 18-year-old, how do we build that into their psychology that it is important to vote? And that's what I would ask.
So much of this resonates with, just to jump in with the work that we're doing at Columbia Votes. When Cooney mentioned, grabbing sort of new voters when they come in, for many first years who turn 18, 6 weeks before an election, it's critical that we are engaging with them their first semester at school, so that we can, as Dr. Gelman mentioned and when Cooney mentioned, get them in the habit of voting. There's so much, I think, so many students, and I said this earlier, so many students come to me and say, why would I bother voting in the presidential election in New York? It's sort of meaningless. And not only would those people, perhaps by not showing up, miss the opportunity to vote down ballot, as when Cooney mentioned, but also miss perhaps that first domino to fall in what could be a lifetime of political engagement, of staying involved. We know that if you vote and register the first time, you're more likely to do it again, to be sort of build that habitual mindset of civic engagement. If we can get you to think about your deadlines and keep track of your ballot, and who's on your ballot, and what's your plan to vote now while you're at school, then wherever you go off after Columbia, you'll be more likely to stay involved. And you might not always be in a deep blue state like New York. You might be here for 4 years, but then you might take that first job in Austin, Texas. And all of a sudden, the fact that we got you in the habit now will have huge electoral consequences. Something that we've been thinking a lot about at Columbia Votes is sort of, we have two main kind of goals. One, the sort of practical, we want as many Columbia students to register and to turn out as possible, very sort of statistical, quantitative, we want higher turnout. But we also have been thinking a lot about building civic engagement and political participation into the culture of Columbia. Sort of, what does it mean to be a Columbia student? Actually, there is an integral part of being a Columbian that is political participation, that is voting. The words we've been using, and we have this sticker or sort of social media campaign, I am a Columbia voter. And that is something that does not stop after you graduate. You might graduate from Columbia in 4 years and then go off into the world, but you are still a Columbia voter. And all of the things that we've been trying to instill, keeping track of your deadlines, keeping involved with politics, who's on your ballot, we hope that will sort of serve you habitually wherever you go off in the world after college. So in the short term, obviously, in turnout for young people is hugely important. In this election, we're really trying to drive turnout now. But we want you to stay involved in those lower salience elections next time. 2021, there's municipal elections in New York. The entire city council is up. The mayor is up. The DA is up. We want Columbia students to take those elections as seriously as they do this one, because voting is an integral part of what it means to be a Columbia student.
Oh, I love that, Zachary. I really do. I mean, it is being civically engaged is part of the DNA of being a Columbia student. And I think that speaks to everybody who's gone to Columbia as a student, as a faculty member, as an administrator. It's sort of being there and being at the forefront of what is happening. But it doesn't have to be only Columbia. I mean, again, when Cooney, we have great things to learn from, and I think sort of crossing those boundaries as well, and having students from different universities come together and work together is absolutely essential. Let me, if I may, broaden the discussion a little bit globally, because all of us around the world have been, there's never been a greater interest, I think, at least that I have witnessed, in U.S. elections as much as there has been in this election. And I can say that sitting in Jordan, where that's about everything that people are focused on. So with us today, I have a few of my colleagues that I'm going to turn to for quick reactions from different parts of the world, and then Dr. Marquez will also curate some questions from our collaboratory students to all of us. So I'm going to start with the director of our Columbia Global Centers in Rio de Janeiro. And in Brazil, of course, we've been dealing with all kinds of issues surrounding democracy and election. I mean, there's a lot of parallel. I don't want to set you up too much, Tom, but Tom Trabat is the director of the Rio Global Center, and I'd love to get a perspective from Latin America, maybe more broadly, and Brazil more specifically from you, Tom. But before you start speaking, I just want to remind our global audience that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to pose questions to any of our panelists. Tom, over to you.
Thank you so much, Safwan, and thank you, Dr. Gelman, Zach, Cooney, Shannon, everyone for putting this together in such a timely way. It must be one of the last occasions we'll have to come together as a group before the elections on November 3rd. But you've asked me to give a view from here in Brazil, and I think it's fair to say the Brazilians are somewhat mystified, understandably so, with how our process works and why there's so much focus on some states and none on others, and how is it that someone can win the popular vote and not be elected president. So there's a lot of concerns about that, and those concerns are heightened by the fact that the position of President of the United States has such an influence on Brazil and on the rest of the world. In Brazil, the election of President Trump in 2016 was a contributing factor to the election of President Jair Bolsonaro in 2018, 2 years later. By the way, in an election, Andy, that the votes were counted within an hour all over the country, and the most votes won, and there wasn't any of this complication that we have in the United States. Brazilians find difficult to understand. But since that point of time, there's been a lot of conflict. Bolsonaro has styled himself the Trump of the tropics. And there have been serious issues in Brazil which echo policy positions in the United States on deforestation, for example, which continues unchecked, on public health, disinformation campaigns, public disinformation about what to do to protect, Brazilians should do to protect themselves against the coronavirus. So we have huge rates of infections and an enormous death toll all over the country. There have been the use of social media to promote hate speech, especially against journalists accused of fake news. And I might add, especially against women journalists who dare to take on the government. So all of that has been sort of reflection of US politics and has aligned Brazil more closely than it has in most of its history with the United States. It's quite unusual. So the question here is what happens after Tuesday? And just a second or two, I think Brazilians tend to think, well, since we've aligned so closely with one presidential candidate, what if the other one wins? What if the new president is Joseph Biden? And there, I think there's much that needs to be thrashed out and discussed, but I do think it's going to be a reset for Brazil-US relationships. And I tend to look at that as generally a positive thing almost from the get-go. I see the possibility over time of these two countries, which are longstanding partners, to get back together on issues that affect the region and the world, on climate change in particular, on global food security. There's two major agricultural exporters in the world, and on political and public safety issues in the region as a whole, including a very problematic case of Venezuela. So these are the issues I think that are motivating Brazilians. I think they're anxiously waiting to see how we sort our ways through all these complex issues, which our three panelists have so clearly placed out for us, but it has very serious implications for Brazil.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. And I just want to invite Andrew, Cooney, and Zachary to join me and Shannon also, if you feel like you want to interject or ask questions to any of our Global Centers directors. But I want to stay in Latin America for a minute and go to Karen Poniatchik, who's the director of the Columbia Global Centers in Santiago. In Chile, of course, we have a plebiscite that's been going on. And you yourself are, if I may say, a sort of a politician, at least in your former life, having served as a minister in Mary Bachelet's government, her first government. So give us a very quick view on how these elections are being perceived in Chile and what kind of repercussions might they have.
Thank you, Safwan. Just a short take on the plebiscite that took place on Sunday. we had the results 2 hours after the polls closed, which was something that we don't see generally in most countries. More than 50% of those who could vote actually voted, which is the largest turnout in the democratic history of Chile, considering that the vote is voluntary. So we should be, as Chileans, very proud of our electoral system, of the CERVEL, which is a service, state service that organizes and manages the elections, and about all Chileans who went to the polls and voted 78% in favor of a constitutional reform. So those are the good news from Chile. Regarding the US elections, I'm afraid that there hasn't been Latin American policy during the Trump government, but unfortunately, there wasn't a Latin American policy during the Obama government either. In terms of South America, of course, Cuba is an issue, and probably Venezuela. Central America, the Biden campaign is talking about transferring $4 billion to Central America, but that has to do more with immigration than with a policy towards the region. So we expect that in this turn, Biden actually focuses on Latin America, especially vis-a-vis what's going on with China, which is very active in the region. So I think the US should definitely try to increase relationships at the commercial and economic level, but as well in terms of soft power. So that's a short take, Safwan.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Okay, from Santiago, we'll go to Istanbul, and to a country that has had its fair share also of issues and tensions with democracy, but it remains sort of a democratic country in a region that has not enjoyed a lot of space, if you will, for electoral systems. So IPEC, director of the Istanbul Columbia Global Center, please share with us the view from Istanbul.
Thank you, Safwan, and thank you to the panel. It was a real delight to listen to the different points of view. And I've been checking out the app, the Politicking app, ever since I learned about it from this part of the world. So I just wanted to say, echoing a little bit what Karen was saying, we've seen, starting with the Obama administration, a withdrawal, so to speak, or an isolationism from global politics and a different way of handling global politics. When I say global politics, I'm talking more about our region, Safwan, and Turkey as well. So the idea, the awareness from the Iraq war and other conflicts in the region, and the kind of managing perhaps from the center as opposed to being engaged on the ground, not just militarily, but overall. So that has obviously taken a different tune with the Trump administration, in the sense that we see from this part of the world that, you know, the way that America looks, the United States looks towards our part of the world and perhaps other parts of the world is more, it's a nationalistic global policy, as opposed to, you know, building alliances, which has been the style of the United States, kind of leading alliances, building alliances, having kind of a moral fabric, or at least an idealistic also nature to some of these alliances. So we see that the US moving away from that role, and with a Biden administration, perhaps some of the emphasis on human rights and some of the emphasis on multilateralism may return, but we don't see a real shift in terms of a shift away from that isolationist view of. So why am I putting this backdrop? Because I think it really affects the way that Turkey will be handled and the region will be handled as well. In terms of Turkey, I mean, I was hearing my colleague Tom talk about Brazil and the issues in Brazil, and nobody is immune to it. Turkey has a lot of troubles, even though on paper it's democratic. We have deep economic problems right now. We've been handling the pandemic okay, but we have human rights problems. We have many journalists and activists in prison. Clearly, we are in a difficult state, and the US alliance and our alliance with Europe usually has counterbalanced in the past some of these sort of actions, interacted with these actions. Perhaps, there was always a give and take. That's the nature of foreign policy, but still it was at times a decent influence. So we're going to be missing that, I'm thinking, with a Biden or a Trump administration. With a Trump administration, we are expecting a more transactional approach, which has been the case with Turkey and the region. So it might look to be on good terms, but really it will not have maybe a fabric of thought or a fabric of, real cooperation in mind. So I think the commercial ties will remain challenged. The cultural and educational ties are still intact. Security cooperation is an issue because of the Russian S-400 purchase, which we're not using them, but it's a big breach in our relationship. So might be lose-lose for Turkey unless we develop an innovative approach with whoever gets elected, and hopefully that will be Biden.
Thank you, Ipek, for bringing the, we have to remain nonpartisan on these things at Columbia.
Sorry.
Okay. I've been trained by my colleagues, just behave, Safwan, is what they kept telling me.
I cannot vote, so.
Yeah, that's true. But Ipek, thank you for bringing the foreign policy perspective. And before I go to Yusuf and then turn it back over to Shannon, I just mentioned something, and perhaps later on during the Q&A, Zachary and Cooney and maybe even Andrew can comment on this. It's been absent from the elections this year, the whole notion of foreign policy. And Roger Cohen, a good friend, wrote in the New York Times after the second Trump-Biden debate that there were words and phrases that were missing in the debate that were not uttered by either Biden or Trump. And he had a whole paragraph, so Syria, Africa, Israel, Palestine, peace, foreign policy. There was nothing on the floor. And to what extent is this really a reflection of the realpolitik in America and what we're dealing with in terms of the internal dynamics in the United States, the tribalism, the polarization, COVID, the Trump years, that the foreign policy issues have sort of not only, they basically disappeared from the stage in these elections. And I'm particularly interested, but again, we'll come back to this during the Q&A because I do want to give a chance for the audience to ask questions. It'll be fascinating to hear from you sort of on the groups that you work with, the youth that you work with, the millennials, like Cooney, for example, where do issues of foreign policy that impact local policy really matter? I'm going to turn last to Yusuf from Tunis. Yusuf is the director of our Global Center in Tunis. And Tunisia, I'll remind everybody, is where the Arab Spring started in 2010, 2011. And it's the only country that has emerged of those protests with actually a transition to a democratic country, democratic form of governance. It has been far from perfect. But it stands alone in the Arab world, in North Africa, as being a democratic nation. Yusuf, you're a political analyst and commentator, and I know that you look at things regionally, not only within Tunisia. You're also very fully aware of how much the United States has historically promoted itself as a leader in promoting democracy around the world. The State Department, USAID, spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year to promote democracy and democratic transitions around the world. How does this election and the past 4 years impact that standing of the United States? So that's a specific question that maybe you can address as you give us your view from Tunis, and then I'll turn it over to Shannon. So over to you, Yusuf.
Thank you, Safwan. And I'll just go back to one point that you mentioned, which is very important, and that's the lack of importance of foreign policy in these elections. Clearly, we're post the Cold War era, and foreign policy comes second in for these elections. And actually, a place like North Africa and Africa in general is at the bottom of the priority list when it comes to foreign policy, which is not even a priority for the next president in the United States. So Africa will come after Latin America, after Europe, after Asia. And therefore, you mentioned democracy promotion, which is very important for Tunisia. And yes, the US has been an important promoter of democracy in the world, but also an important backer of authoritarianism in the world as well, especially in Africa. So here you have the dichotomy between support to democracies and support to dictatorial regimes, sometimes very neighboring regimes. But in the case of Tunisia, of course, it worked very well, especially in the last 10 years. But with the Trump administration, what we've witnessed in, at least in Tunisia, is a lack of interest from at the official level. So the number of high-level officials visiting the country decreased considerably compared to the Obama era. And actually, when you look around, a place like Morocco, for instance, where during the Obama administration, there were serious efforts for democracy promotion, that was almost put on the side completely. And the Trump administration went for more transactional diplomacy, like what Ipek just mentioned earlier. So we've seen in Morocco, for instance, a decrease in the indicators related to democracy. In other countries in Africa, also the stress was more on security cooperation, attempts to counter great powers, China and Russia, more than democracy promotion or for economic reforms, etc., etc. So if we have a Trump presidency coming after, then we will see a continuation of the same policy. If we have a Biden administration, then I go back to my first point. Foreign policy won't be that important anyway. There will be perhaps less transactional diplomacy. There will be perhaps more pressures when it comes to promoting democracy and respecting human rights in this part of the world, but nothing revolutionary. And I think the trends will remain as they are at this point. So foreign policy and Africa will be a lesser priority for the next administration. Thank you.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you. So where I'm sitting, which is not very far from where you are, Yusuf, or where you are, Ipek, in Jordan, I see a different perspective. You know, I see people here really hoping for a Biden presidency. I see a little bit of apathy and distrust that, you know, on the one hand, it doesn't make a difference which American president we have. It's going to be bad for the majority of the region. But I also see tremendous frustration and very strong emotions against Trump, and they hope for a Biden presidency. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you, Shannon, because I know that you have at least one student from the collaboratory who you're going to introduce, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So over to you, Shannon.
Thank you. And we're excited that we actually have a number of students who submitted questions today. And we are really honored to have one of them live and in person, Ella Sengri. And so welcome to the seminar. And why don't you introduce yourself and ask your question, which I think is probably directed to Cooney, since it relates to social media, the internet, and apps, and the future of their use. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ella Sangri. I'm a sophomore in CC studying sustainable development. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. And over the past few weeks, the role of social media in elections and in all the discussions, obviously, now have really been interesting to me. I recently saw that Twitter was warning users about misinformation about early polling results. And with that, I just wanted to know what your thoughts are about the future of social media and elections and how misinformation can be so easily spread. And with that, where we can draw the line between censoring misinformation and educating people about misinformation, but also obviously avoiding issues with free speech, et cetera. And also wondering if you think the responsibility to stop this easily misspread information is on the responsibility of the platforms themselves, thinking about Twitter, Facebook, et cetera.
Ella, thank you for the question. I'm also in DC, so this is pressing, especially where we are located geographically speaking. We have a duty to dispel digital misinformation, and that's been rampant. I do mean rampant in this election. And, particularly, Ella, it's unfortunate that it's targeting certain communities, right? It's targeting communities that perhaps haven't had the privileges of sitting in the classrooms that we've had. And so we see that Black and Latinx voters are actually more susceptible to that type of digital disinformation, but they're not the only ones. We see in these platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, we see a lot of information that's being spread. We hear that we have voting bots calling people's telephones and telling them that they're not allowed to vote for whatever reason, etc. And so there is an onus on these companies to take that sort of responsibility to ensure that this information isn't being dispelled throughout the platforms, but it's also our jobs as educated and informed voters, as American citizens and active constituents, to ensure that we're doing our own homework and making sure that we're fact checking, making sure that we're getting the right information, and that we're turning to nonpartisan sources like politicking, like Columbia Votes, to find out that information, because it's the best way to cut through the partisan rhetoric that we've seen that's extremely, extremely rampant in this particular election. So I hope that answered your question. I think the best thing that we can do to dispel digital disinformation is to arm ourselves with correct information, and that means doing our research ahead of time.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. And next, I want to direct a question to Zachary, and it's actually a pre-recorded question coming from a student who had a conflict. And so let me start the question.
Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm a sophomore in CC. Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm a sophomore in CC, and my question is about Election Day being more of an election season this year and how it's being talked about. So if the media frenzy on the night of the election can't conclusively decide a winner, what does Election Day actually mean then? Is there a date set before January 20th that a winner must be decided by? And how does this compare to the 2000s elections and the ties with the Supreme Court? Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm a sophomore.
Okay, Zachary.
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I think something that I've at least seen in terms of the narrative around Election Day is actually not that voting happens necessarily on Election Day, but that voting ends on Election Day. That is sort of not when it occurs, but actually when the last day to vote. I think the encouragement of early voting is really terrific, and I think all of this energy and the lines, while troublesome in some ways that we have 3-hour, 4-hour, 5-hour waits for democracy in America in 2020, are very inspiring. And there is so much energy to get out early. I think that I do think there is a responsibility on our major media outlets to avoid as much as possible the temptation to call something that is not yet ready to be called. I think you saw this in 2000 with an eagerness of certain stations to call the state of Florida before it was really ready to be called. And I think that there really needs to be more, from ideally from both major parties, but particularly a focus from our major media organizations, actually that this could be a process that takes several weeks. In terms of a specific date, I believe, I'm not confident offhand, and maybe perhaps one of our more seasoned panelists knows this offhand. I believe that the Electoral College, the electors actually vote in December. That there is sort of the selection happens or ends on election day, November 3rd, but then the actual voting of the electors is in December, and then obviously inauguration day, January 2021. I believe that is like sort of the day that it happens, if you will. But I think the narrative around election day being the end of voting versus the day that voting happens encourages people to get out early, and also definitely helps to cultivate the sense that actually, this is going to be a longer drawn out process, but we're going to need some buy-in from our major media organizations to convey to the American public that this might not be sort of a night of conclusive thing, and they have to resist the urge to call a state, call one of those key swing states before it's really ready to be called.
Professor Gelman, I wonder if you can also weigh in on this important question.
I think that I don't really have anything to add. I mean, I think I think one of the biggest problems is not so much the rules changing, but the rules being not clear and then being manipulable or subject to debate. So I think that's like the biggest problem is not so much the exact way that votes are counted, but the idea that it's not agreed upon. And so that's one more place where things can be manipulated in a non-democratic way.
Thank you. Now our next question from Shelley Michael. It might be good if all of the panelists could consider this. It's another video, so let me share this for us to have a listen.
Hi, my name is Shelley Michael. I'm a political science student at Columbia College. Hi, my name is Shelley Michael. I'm a political science student at Columbia College. This is my question. Currently, candidates are given free rein during debates and are not really required to remain truthful in their responses. Do you believe that live fact-checking and moderation could be a part of future presidential and other high office debates? Moreover, do you believe that a change like this could have any impact on elections based on the respective candidates' answers? Thank you so much.
So I know that all of us have things we can weigh in on this, but I'd love to hear from the panelists your perspective.
Yeah, I think it was an excellent question. I agree with her 100%. I think the way we're moving towards in a society that's so technologically driven, we absolutely have to fact check, because that's how we dispel some of that digital disinformation that I think Ella mentioned earlier. We cannot allow elected officials or candidates to propagate false or fake news to the American public. I mean, it's simply criminal. And that goes on both sides of the coin. So I think we absolutely have to see that fact checking instituted, and we have to look towards sources that are already doing that tough work. Sometimes that causes people to get away from the sources that they're very comfortable with, the large media organizations. I won't call them out. But you have to search for information in places that are nonpartisan if you truly want a nonpartisan view on what your elected officials are saying. And secondarily, you have to hold them accountable. The only way that we can hold them accountable is by doing that research, is by doing the homework that necessitates in being an informed and educated voter.
Great.
On the panel?
Anyone else? Okay. So Shannon, do we have any other collaboratory questions, or shall we turn to the global audience questions?
Oh, go ahead to turn to the global audience. We have other questions coming in and I'll interject.
Great, wonderful. So this one, I think, Zachary, is for you. And it's from Gwen DeLuca. Do you think that civic duty and knowledge should begin at least at the high school level, and that the educational curriculum must include a mandatory civic class throughout the country and so on? So, basically, why wait until college to get that kind of engagement and to get the knowledge and learn about civic duty?
Absolutely. It's a really good question. The answer is yes. I think it's still a focus on college is important. Still, in most states, the age to register to vote is 18. So there is that really critical window for some first-year students who come to school not yet registered to vote, and we need to sort of capture them early on in the process, because if you come to college and you're in the fall and there's an election in 6 weeks, it's really important that someone talks to you early on and asks you to register to vote. Many colleges, Northwestern, SUNY Binghamton, SUNY Stony Brook, have implemented registration as part of orientation. So it's sort of a fundamental part of coming to college, just the same as getting your meal plan or getting your housing assignment. And I would love to see Columbia take that on. But yes, I think that high school civics is a really amazing intervention, a really good place to start. Increasingly, more and more states are allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. New York is one of them. So having civics curricula in place across the board, but particularly in those states that allow older teenagers to pre-register, is really key. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is sort of, there are some organizations that I've become familiar with. I think Generation Citizen is one, that are really looking to cultivate and develop more sort of activist, hands-on civics curricula that is not simply your state has 2 senators, this is election day, sort of the nuts and bolts of American politics, which are still very important. I think we'd be better off if more Americans knew the nuts and bolts of our democratic process, but also a push towards not only knowing the information and knowledge, but actually getting involved. How to petition your congressman, how to get in touch with them. Who are your local reps? Where are their offices? What are the issues that they stand on? How do you find information about your local candidates? How do you run for office? How do you start a petition? Sort of all of these kind of more activist, hands-on, immersive parts of the democratic process, rather than just simply a knowledge of the structure of Congress. That's really exciting to me. I think and I think that kind of focus on an activist civics curricula will help to check a lot of the apathy that we then see in young people, that my vote doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter who I vote for anyway. Actually, because you've been learning for the past several years in high school, all of these ways that you can directly get involved, that you can directly make your voice heard, that you can directly hold your representatives to account for the issues that you care about. And I think that kind of reframing of civics curricula, it should be across the board, across the country, but then it should also be sort of vamped up and made into more of a hands-on kind of activist civics curricula, I think. And that's I think where the direction that we should push it is.
So Zachary, a follow-up question from me. Have you considered, and maybe since we have so many students attending this webinar, have you considered going out into the high schools in the Morningside Heights area, in the Harlem area, around Columbia University, as guest speakers and as people who can get that activism going?
Yes, and actually there is a part of Columbia Votes. We have a youth outreach coordinator who does this. This is exactly her job, coordinating with local high schools in the neighborhood, public, private, religious schools, and trying to sort of build partnerships with them so that we as students as college students can go out into local high schools and sort of teach this sort of more activist, hands-on civics curricula. It was really starting to get going in the spring, and then obviously the COVID sort of explosion really kind of disrupted that plan. That is absolutely something that we still really care about and want to do and have in mind. It is something that we'll probably have to wait at least a certain extent until sort of COVID subsides, sure, to a certain extent, we can go back into high schools. But yes, that getting Columbia Vote students, getting other Columbia undergraduates in front of local high school classrooms, teaching civics, teaching activist civics, teaching engaged, immersive civics is absolutely something that I would love for Columbia Votes to do, and then also for the university as a whole to support and encourage as well.
That's fantastic. Cooney, anything you want to add to that? I mean, do you work with high school students at that level? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, no, first of all, Zachary, hats off to you for the tremendous work that you're doing. We work with high school students as well as college students. And we particularly focus on, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and students that are going into those communities. We're actually doing an event this evening with an organization called HBCU Unite, which is actually recruiting young Black and brown students to go to HBCUs, and we're talking to them about politics because we know it's never too soon to begin that conversation. And it's like what Zachary says, we need to see a systematic reimagining of what that political curriculum looks like. I think it's been very civics oriented in the past, and that's fundamental. We have to keep that, but we also have to move towards that activism. As we see, I always tell people we're in a COVID-19 pandemic. We're also in a racial inequity pandemic. And I think the United States is finally actualizing that. And so we have to arm our children, which really are the leaders of the next generation, with the right information to be able to combat the systemic injustice that we're seeing in the United States. And so I think, like Zachary said, moving towards that activist curriculum is extremely important in that. And I encourage everyone to reach back out to those communities, whether it be high school, or even middle school. You know, it's really never too early to start learning it. A lot of times we survey people with politicking. When's the last time you had a civics course or anything like that? Fifth grade. Fifth grade is the last time most Americans talked about, you know, the different systems of government, or even identified some of the words that we're hearing on CNN or Fox News every day. But oftentimes a lot of people don't know. And what we call that is that disinformation, again, because the legalese jargon that a lot of times these amendments and referendums are written with, they're not at the understanding of the everyday American, and that's intentional. And so we have to make sure that we're providing people with the information so that they can understand actually what they're voting for. It's not only about the candidates, but also about the amendments and referendums that are appearing on those ballots.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Shannon, I think you have a question for Professor Gelman from a student.
Yes, I do. So this question is from Nicholas Di Constanzo, who's a general studies majoring, in the College of General Studies. He's majoring in visual arts. He's a first-year student. And so his question is as follows. On CNN last week, there was a story that compared statistics from 2 weeks before the 2016 presidential election with last week's statistics for this election, and Biden was doing better across the board. The statistics we were presented with for this seminar show Biden as likely to win the 2020 election. However, Dr. Gelman pointed out that statistical models for elections may be unreliable, and given what we know from past elections, Democratic popularity at the polls does not always match the outcome of the elections. How can we make more accurate predictive models? Can we compare pre-election data polling results with election outcomes year over year? And if so, what could we learn from these comparisons? Can we use them to make more accurate predictions?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, the predictions that people have are already using what information available. The difficulty is there just aren't a lot of past elections. Like, you know, a presidential election is 50 little elections, but they're not 50 independent elections. So I think that if we thought the polls were accurate, then we would give Biden closer to 100% chance of winning. The reason why we might say he only has a 90% chance or a 95% chance is the polls could be off by a bit, but you can't completely anticipate what's going to happen. I mean, I think, like, to the extent that you can use past information or existing information to do better, it might be in local elections. So people aren't always looking so carefully at local elections, right? There are thousands of state legislators all over the country. You know, there could be more information there. For the presidential election, at some level, you just have some national uncertainty that it's hard to know what to say about.
Right. To bring it back to to stay with the issue of polls. So there are a number of questions.
Safwan? Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
Go ahead, Shannon, be better to take over.
Safwan might have had a technical issue, so let's try to pull one last question relating to the elections. I'm wondering now, on the brink of, you know, what we're going to experience this coming week. And with all of the information and news out about how people may respond if the election results aren't ready that evening, and how different states have actually had different policies in place, some of them supportive, some of them not, with regard to making everyone's vote count. What are your final thoughts as we're about to close this up regarding sort of when we wake up next week in this new reality with regard to all of the, excuse me, predictions and discourse around if we don't have the results in hand that evening? I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, particularly with regard to the different demographics that are now really galvanized in this moment.
I could start. I would say the first thing I would advise people is do not expect an election result on November 4th. I think the first thing is mitigating our own personal expectations. Historically, that's been the case. We are in a very, very different era than the past, and it's just not reasonable to expect election results on November 4th. And so I think what we have to do is really ensure that we're fundamentally okay with that first, and knowing that we may not know, because what we're seeing is in a lot of states, they're allowing for up to 7 days after November 3rd to actually receive those ballots. So that means that if we're actually trying to ensure that every vote counts or matters, the last day that you can postmark something is November 3rd. And so you have to allow those 7 business days to ensure that those votes are also counted. And so I think people have to just understand maybe mid-November, maybe even December, like Zachary noted, that's when we're going to be finding out who the actual president-elect is. And I think people have to take time and really temper their expectations with the government. That being said, I've seen a lot of people encouraging people, if you have not already put your ballot in the mail, I would advise going to a drop-off center, because that will ensure your ballots gets counted a little bit quicker. I would suggest going to vote in person if you can do that at this particular point. I know the lines are long. I know that there's a lot of things in the way. Personally, for me, sometimes it's even the weather. It's cold outside. It's a long line, but I think that we have to do our civic duty, and that's voting. And so I encourage people, any way that you're going to get your vote actualized, make sure that it counts. If you do send it in the mail, please go to your Board of Elections website and check that it's been received and or counted. There are ways to do that. I've had friends that have been able to verify if their votes have been received and accounted for. And so I urge everyone on the call listening to be able to do that. And I just want to say that this has been a tremendous panel, and so honored to be a part.
Professor Gelman and Zachary, any final thoughts on that?
I have nothing to add. I appreciate the opportunity to virtually meet all of you. And yep, nothing to add beyond what was just said.
I know, but you have to go soon. So I just want to thank you. I mean, really, you've really helped contextualize things for us. And this has been so much fun, you know, having a scholar and having students and former students, and then regional experts representing Colombia all over the world, sharing their views. So just in case you have to go, Andrew, I didn't want you to leave without a public expression of gratitude.
Thank you.
Thank you. Zachary.
I thought when Cooney hit it on the head, I was gonna say very much the same about if you haven't put your ballot in the mail yet, you know, try to vote in person or try to, you know, drop it off. I definitely think, you know, tempering our expectations is important and is going to be key in this. I am sort of the optimist. I think there's a chance we will know perhaps on November 4th. I know that's perhaps maybe I should take Wen Cooney's advice and temper my own expectations, but I definitely think there's a possibility we have a pretty good sense of who won. Not saying that that's going to happen, but I think there could be a chance of that happening. Regardless, I think the mindset someone said earlier about election season is a really valuable one, not only for this election, but for future elections where you're going to have more early voting, you're going to have more voting by mail, I hope, in future elections. that sort of shift in mindset is going to be really key. We might know on November 4th, we might not, and either way, the election will be secure and will be fair. And I think I hope that the processes are there to ensure that every vote that is legitimate is counted.
Okay.
Yep.
I wanted to give you a chance to make any final remarks. We're glad that you made it back.
Thank you, Shannon. Sorry, lost my Wi-Fi for a minute. I mean, I said some of it in thanking Andrew. I just want to thank Cooney and Zachary. You make me feel incredibly hopeful about the future. And I'm going to follow with great interest your trajectories because I know that you have great presence and you will have even greater futures. And thank you for all the work that you do. I'm going to take your side, Zachary, in terms of predicting next week. I think it will be decisive, and I think we will. We're not going to go to sleep on November 3rd, so I'm not going to say we're going to wake up. But we will find out on November 4th. But this has been fantastic, Shannon, and thank you for your partnership on this. Thank you for your curation and for the collaboratory students. And I want to acknowledge and thank Tom Trebat, who really was a driving force behind organizing and conceptualizing this webinar. And I want to thank EPEC, Youssef, Karen, for their contributions, and thank all the students and all the audience members who joined us and for the questions they asked. We tried to get to as many of them as possible, and I saw that a number of the panelists also responded to questions privately. So thanks again to everyone. And the most important message in all of this is, if you haven't voted yet, vote. Every single vote counts. And when people were telling me in Jordan, Shannon, why are you so stressed about getting your absentee ballot? You're in New York, it's not going to make a difference. And I said, I could not live with myself if I did not vote in this election. And I really meant that. So vote, get out the vote, go out and vote. Over to you, Shannon.
Sure, I want to give Zachary a chance to say something.
I was just going to say one really quick thing on that note. I think for young people, especially, when this is perhaps the first presidential election we're voting in, it can be hard to hear, this is the most consequential election of our lifetime. This might be the first real election that we're taking seriously. So I just wanted to pick up on something that Safwan said, that to beat a dead horse, this is the most consequential election of our lifetime, even if it is even if our lifetime is sort of shorter in comparison. There will come a time, I'm absolutely certain of this, where our children and our grandchildren will ask, what did you do in this election? How did this feel? What did it feel like to live through summer and fall 2020? Grandma, granddad, what did you do? And I think you're going to want to say, I voted and I got involved. And I think that you're going to want to be able to tell your children, your grandchildren, that amidst all of this craziness, the process held and you got involved and you participated and you had your voice heard. I think that is something that you will want to tell your children, your grandchildren, even though that might be far off in the future. They will ask about this, and you will want to be able to tell them what you did.
That's wonderful, Zachary, and really fitting to close with those comments. I've really enjoyed this engaging discussion, really about, I guess it's the most pressing concern in the US right now, because the election of the president is very important for us, and we are about to really see this occur right before our eyes. We've talked about everything from foreign policy and impacts around the world to the use of predictive models, social media, information on the internet. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the first seminar for the Fall Global Collaboratory, our virtual exchange platform that's bringing thought leaders and undergraduates and educators from around the world to reflect, ideate, and collaborate. And we're looking forward to the exciting lineup for the remainder of the collaboratory global seminars this semester. So keep an eye out for our announcements about upcoming programs. Thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us today. This has been an amazing discussion. Special thanks to Safwan and the team at Columbia Global Centers, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, special thanks to our amazing students, partners, and participants from around the world. As a reminder that a link to a recording of the full webinar will be sent to everyone who registers. And so please feel free to go back and listen to the recording if you've missed anything, or also invite others. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Have a great one.